Hi, I'm Ollie Neal, and you're listening to the Equip Project podcast. The Equip Project is designed to help young people engage with the Christian faith in a thoughtful and reasonable way. Our goal is to help provide clarity and understanding as we seek to tackle many of the cultural and intellectual challenges to Christianity. I'm the youth and young adults worker here at Crescent Church in Belfast, and sitting alongside me is Jim Crooks. Jim is chairman of Christian Unions Ireland and an elder and Bible teacher here at Crescent Church. Welcome, Jim.
Hello, Ollie. Here we go again. I'll have to remember to put the heat on next time. Belfast isn't exactly the Bahamas at this time of year.
It's really not. It's absolutely freezing out there. It's even colder here than it is back home in England, which is cold and wet enough, to be honest.
Yes, we should probably begin, or at least before we begin, explain how a 27-year-old from the south of England has ended up working for a church in Belfast.
That's a good question. I'll be honest, it involves a girl, I have to confess.
It always does.
I came to Belfast back in 2016 to study a master's and ultimately ended up meeting Rachel, who now happens to be my wife. So she lured me over here. She's to blame, and that's why I'm in this part of the world. But I must say, I'm actually really glad she did, despite the weather, because it's a great place to live.
Actually, the video of your wedding popped up on my Facebook feed last night. It looked tremendous.
Yeah, and it rained reliably. It did rain. I'm sure you saw the umbrellas.
It was lovely. It was a lovely day.
But yeah, so Jim, today's topic is a weighty one. The world can be a beautiful place. We've just been talking about Northern Ireland, and I genuinely do think the North Coast is one of the most stunning places on earth. I'm not just saying that to butter up the people listening. I genuinely think it's a stunning place. I remember looking out at one particular spot and just being captivated by how beautiful it was. And at moments like that, the world seems very good. It seems just as God said it was in Genesis, very good. But that's only one part of the human story, because our world is also full of pain and suffering. The people we care about die, and sometimes they die in terrible, terrible ways. And ultimately, we'll die too. So our lives are full of physical and psychological hurt. And that raises a problem for those of us who believe in the God of the Bible. The thing we call the problem of pain. It raises significant questions for many people, such as, why does God allow suffering? Why is there so much suffering in the world? And how can a good, all-powerful God allow suffering?
Well, there are two basic ways we can approach these sorts of questions. We can either talk about suffering in a personal, pastoral way, displaying empathy towards people who are suffering, and that is a really important thing to do. Or we can approach the subject in a more clinical, rational way. People who are in the middle of suffering need both types of answer, in my experience. They need empathy, but they also need understanding. And I guess it's only fair, Ollie, that we make it clear up front that the conversation we are about to have is going to focus more on giving understanding rather than providing a focus on personal pastoral help.
I understand that, Jim, but before we address the intellectual problem of pain, do you mind if I ask you a little bit about suffering in your own life? This question isn't just a theoretical one for you, is it?
No, it's not. I am a widower. My wife, Ruth, died from leukemia when she was just 36.
And you met Ruth here at Crescent Church, didn't you?
Yes, we did. I was 5 years older than Ruth, and we met just through some of the ministries here at the church.
What was she like?
Ruth was a kind, quietly determined woman. She was full of goodness, and I remember I gave the tribute at her funeral, and I remember saying she had the understated confidence of a truly intelligent woman. She was a great listener. That's what made her an excellent doctor. But she did hate being embarrassed. I mean, the thing Ruth loathed was being in the limelight, and so very, very different from me.
That's a wonderful tribute to her. Before you moved into Christian ministry, you were director of software engineering at BT Group. So how did that affect your home life?
Well, at a practical level, it meant I travelled a great deal. I mean, I spent a great deal of my life on an aeroplane. And, I enjoyed my job hugely, and Ruth was glad to see me happy and fulfilled in my work life. But I do slightly regret the amount of time that I spent away. We did we loved each other very much, but I do slightly regret the amount of time I spent away from home.
Would you be able to share a little bit about when you first learned she was sick?
I remember it very, very vividly. It was 5:10 on the 17th of May 2004. By the Lord's mercy, I happened to be working in Belfast, and Ruth called me and told me to come home, and I knew that there was something terribly serious going on. And she told me she had been diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia. And so the next day, she was taken into hospital and then spent 7 weeks receiving chemotherapy. And then she passed away into the presence of the Lord on the 5th of July.
That must have been an intensely difficult period of your life, Jim. And I realized Ruth was a Christian believer, and I wanted to know how she coped with her illness.
Well, my fear at the start was that she was using her reservoir of natural resilience to help me and the rest of her family through this difficult experience. But what then came about throughout the course of her treatment was the what I would call the natural pure gold of a genuine faith emerged. She really did trust God. I mean, the last thing she said to me, other than that she loved me, was she said, "Jim, my life in this earth is ending. I'm going home, and I'm not afraid."
That's an incredible thing to say in that situation. And Ruth's response to suffering, it sounds pretty different, very different, in fact, from the sort of questions I mentioned in my introduction. The idea that people look at suffering and they actually get angry and shake their fist at God. That sounds like something very different went on there.
It is. I mean, you're right to say that a lot of people are full of anger when they suffer. And here's the point. If we're to have this conversation, if it is to have any traction, we have to deal with the anger issue up front. It's almost impossible to have a useful conversation about suffering unless we surface the anger question.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, Jim. The best example of an angry reaction, I think, comes from Stephen Fry in that famous interview a number of years back. He was on an Irish TV chat show and he was asked what he would say if he ever found himself standing before God. And I have his answer here printed out in front of me. And this is what he claimed he would say to God. He said, "How dare you create a world in which there is such misery that is not our fault. It's not right. It's utterly, utterly evil. Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world which is so full of injustice and pain? Bone cancer in children, what's that about?"
Yeah, it's a very famous quote. And later on in the interview, Fry says, "It's perfectly apparent that God is monstrous, utterly monstrous, and deserves no respect whatsoever. At the moment you banish him, life becomes simpler, purer, cleaner, more worth living, in my opinion."
Yeah, you can sense the anger and contempt, I think, in that quote. And he's raising a really disturbing question, isn't he? Because how can you trust in God's wisdom and justice and love when simultaneously you see things happening to people you love most, or you watch unspeakable horrors on the news?
Well, I think the best way into this conversation is to make a really simple point. We need to believe something about suffering. It's not enough to throw rocks at Christianity. We live in a world where children die of bone cancer, and we each need to decide what we believe about that.
So you don't start with the Christian response to suffering?
No, I start by simply thinking about the phenomenon of suffering itself, and I think the Bible backs up that approach. The book of the Bible that addresses this problem most directly is the book of Job. Now, I believe that Job was a real man who went through real suffering, but his struggle is presented to us as a beautifully sculpted work of literature. It's helpful, I think, to think of it as a stage play, maybe a bit like one of those dark pieces by Samuel Beckett. And for most of the play, Job the sufferer is centre stage. He's surrounded by a group of philosophers, as if he didn't have enough problems. And God remains off stage for nearly all of the play. He only comes on at the very end. So if we were watching this as a play, then for most of it, we would see a suffering man sitting centre stage, arguing with a set of philosophers about why he is suffering. So the basic preliminary point I always make in this sort of a conversation is this. Even if we take God off stage, as Mr. Fry asks us to, the phenomenon of suffering still remains centre stage. In Stephen Fry's Brave New World, do 36-year-old women still die of leukemia? Of course they do. We have to believe something about suffering. It isn't good enough simply to throw rocks at Christianity. We have to believe something.
So what you're suggesting is we take Christianity off stage for now and just think about suffering as a phenomenon. So we're just going to think about it as an aspect of the human condition. What then happens when we suffer?
I think two things happen. We're confronted when we suffer by two big questions. First, suffering triggers a crisis about our very existence. What has happened to my life? Something has gone terribly wrong. All my certainties and securities have been torn down. In chapter 3 of Job, we hear Job curse the day of his birth. In really dramatic language, he's asking the biggest question of them all. What is my life? What is this thing called life? I am a man, but what does that mean? What is man? So in technical language, Job's suffering has triggered an existential crisis. He no longer understands what life is. So for the next 35 chapters, Job is surrounded by these 4 philosophers who try to explain to him why he is suffering. And the first thing he's told is that his suffering doesn't matter because he doesn't matter. Man is a maggot, he is told. So your suffering has no more significance than the moment when I step on a slug. Your suffering doesn't matter because man doesn't matter. Now that answer is entirely in line with Stephen Fry's atheism. If atheism is true, then human beings are just a random piece of self-replicating matter floating down the river of time. And the conclusion that flows from that belief system is that you're a maggot, you're a worm, a blob of biological slime. Atheism and the religions of the East have the same answer to suffering. Ultimately, it doesn't matter because you have no more significance than a slug. Now remember, you have to believe something about suffering. In the brave new world of Mr. Stephen Fry, there is terrible suffering. So let's imagine we enter a hospital room and we see Mr. and Mrs. Jones crying beside the bed in which their little girl lies, dying from bone cancer. And let me quickly say, if that scenario isn't hypothetical for some listener, please forgive me for raising painful memories. But what would Fry say if he was in that hospital room? Well, Mrs. Jones, you have been really, really unlucky. Most little girls don't have the genetic mutation carried by your daughter. They are lucky, and you are unlucky. That is all I can say to you. Goodbye. Now, once that conclusion is reached, the absurdity of Fry's rant starts to become clear. Did you notice when, in that quote, he railed against God for being evil, for allowing a world full of injustice? But in the brave new world of atheism, there is no such thing as evil or injustice. There's only luck. Mr. and Mrs. Jones can't even protest at the wrongness of their situation. Atheism has struck them dumb. According to the philosophers, Mr. and Mrs. Jones and their little girl aren't persons. They're maggots. And maggots don't even rise to the dignity of suffering.
So your first point was that suffering triggers an existential crisis. We are forced to ask ourselves, what is my life? But you mentioned that suffering surfaces 2 big questions, and I'm wondering what that second is.
Yeah, the second question triggered by suffering is this. Who or what is in charge of my life? I mean, I guess the most obvious thing about suffering is that it is the moment when we realize that we're not in control of our lives. But if I'm not in control, then who or what is in control? Let's go back to Job for a moment. It seems to me that there are some strong links between the religion of Job's 3 friends and the religions of Hinduism and Buddhism. Most religions of the East believe that suffering is a form of atonement. In other words, if I suffer, it's because I have sinned. Suffering is punishment for previous sin. And Hindus call this cosmic principle karma. Karma isn't a god, as we would understand the concept of God. Karma is an impersonal principle. It's a cosmic rule, if you like. It's like a great big moral equation that balances all man's sin by dishing out an appropriate amount of suffering. And all of Job's friends follow the same idea. You see, their God isn't a personal God. He's more like a rule. And here's the thing. You cannot plead before a rule. That would be like asking the laws of arithmetic to make 2 + 2 = 5. Just this once, please. All we can do is bow before unyielding fate. I am not in charge of my life. My life is governed by karma. Now, Ollie, here's a really strange thing. The beliefs we find in the East are very close to the atheism of Mr. Stephen Fry. And that might seem strange to you, so let me explain. I've just said that a Hindu believes that life is governed by a rule. His rule is called karma. Okay, karma is an impersonal cosmic principle. But an atheist from the West also believes that life is governed by a rule. His rule is called chance or entropy or some other scientific term. So both the pantheist and the atheist think that life is governed by rules. They both reject the idea of a personal God. Life is governed by principles that are mindless and cosmic. So in fact, atheism is very close to the religions of the East. In the East, your fate is controlled by karma. In the atheistic West, your fate is controlled by chance.
Let's go back to the hypothetical scenario you described a while ago about Mr. and Mrs. Jones, the parents of the little girl dying from bone cancer. How does the question about who controls life matter to them?
Well, once again, they cannot protest at the wrongness of their situation. If there is no personal God, then life is controlled by impersonal principles, either fate or chance. So this suffering couple, to use a phrase from a poet, must stand under the unfeeling immensity of the universe, controlled by forces too dumb even to know they exist.
You've suggested a strategy which doesn't start with the Christian response to suffering. Instead, you've analysed suffering as an aspect of the human condition. Your two big points are that suffering forces us to examine what a human life actually is.
Yes, the existential crisis.
And then suffering forces us to address the question, who or what controls my life?
Mm-hmm.
So I agree that forcing all of us, whatever our beliefs may be, to confront those questions will help dilute the anger and move the conversation on to a more thoughtful place. But now I must ask, what is the Christian response to suffering?
Okay, I'm going to make 4 points to sum up the Christian response to suffering. And the first one is that Christianity allows us to protest at the wrongness of suffering. One of the greatest blessings of Christianity is that it allows us to protest. We cry out against the injustice of the thing. We can ask God, why is there suffering? But in the atheistic world of Fry and Dawkins, no one hears you scream. You're met with blind, pitiless indifference. Job's great struggle is his desire to have a person-to-person confrontation with God. He wants to put his case as a human person to a divine person. But these philosophers are determined to stop that. They have reduced Job the person to a maggot, and they have reduced God the person to a cosmic rule. Now, Mr. Fry might call that world a simpler, purer, cleaner, and more worthwhile way to live. Personally, I think it sounds hellish. I remember one night when Ruth was going through her chemo treatment, and I found myself holding one of those little cardboard dishes so that she could be sick into it. And I was overwhelmed with the sheer injustice of the situation. What possible good could this experience achieve? And inside my head, I was protesting to God. And I think it must be terrible to live in a world where no one hears your cry.
So, as I understand it, the first response is that Christianity allows us to protest in this way. What then is the second response?
Well, the second point I would like to make is that the Bible's explanation for suffering is that we are part of a good world gone bad. So let's think about that for a moment. Western culture has taught us to regard ourselves as autonomous little beings. But of course that's nonsense. To be human is to be part of an organic unity. Your DNA can be traced right back to your first parents, to Adam and Eve. You're only here because they multiplied. To be human is to be part of the human race. The Bible puts it this way. It says, we are all in Adam. So we inherit characteristics of our forefathers. That's just part of the deal of being human. Now, without the gospel, of course, that is a sobering thought, because the human race is appallingly sinful. When we hear those terrible accounts of the gas chambers of Auschwitz, we shake our heads and say, how inhuman. No, it's not. It's completely human. When millions of people died under Stalin and Chairman Mao, they weren't dying because of inhuman actions. Their fate was completely human. Philosophers divide evil into two categories. They talk about moral evil and natural evil. Human beings commit moral evils like murder and rape and drink driving, and then there are the natural evils like tsunamis and bone cancer. Now, did you notice Stephen Fry didn't mention any moral evil in his rant against God? He conveniently omitted the greatest source of suffering in the world, which is the evil perpetrated by human beings. We're all in Adam, and in Adam, moral evil has multiplied. Any sane person, their heart must have been torn by those awful pictures of starving children in Yemen. They lie in there with their distended stomachs on dusty streets in the last stages of starvation. Now, here's the thing. There's more than enough food on this planet to feed them. Those children are dying because they're caught up in a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
But what about tsunamis and leukemia? Surely those forms of suffering can't be placed at the feet of human beings. How would you respond to issues like that?
Well, remember, the Bible presents a much more complicated view of reality than you'll find in a science textbook. There is more to reality than quarks and atoms and molecules, more than physical stuff. If Christianity is true, then behind the material world that we touch and see, there are spiritual forces that are opposed to the rule of God in the universe. It wasn't only Adam and Eve who rebelled, but it was their rebellion which triggered a huge dislocation within nature. The Bible talks of creation groaning as the planet became a battle zone in which rebellious humanity and the dark forces that oppose God's will tried to create a no-go area for the Creator. And as a result, we can see that creation itself has become distorted. Congenital disorders and the grotesque aspects of the natural world were never meant to be like that. We're part of a good world gone bad.
Jim, you've argued that we're part of a good world gone bad. Most of the evil in this world comes from the human heart, and the fall of creation itself into a spiritual battleground was triggered by human sin. But that doesn't seem to get to the heart of the question I raised at the start. Why would a good, all-powerful God create a universe which could go bad?
Okay, we're going to need to think carefully for the next few minutes. The third point that I'm making here is this. In a world where good can flourish, the potential for evil must exist. So in rough terms, Christianity says that in a world where good flourishes, the possibility of evil must exist. It's logically impossible for there to be a world where good can flourish, but where evil is impossible. So let's take an analogy. Imagine a garden. The soil in that garden can produce beautiful flowers, or a crop like wheat. But it can also produce weeds. It's logically impossible to have a garden that is incapable of supporting the growth of weeds. If you want a world where good can flourish, then the possibility, the latent potential of evil must also exist. Now, I was unusually careful in my choice of words there. There are some religions which argue that at the heart of reality we find an eternal struggle between good and evil, between light and dark and yin and yang. They're what's called dualistic religions, and Christianity has no truck with dualism. God is light, he is wholly good. My point about the potential of evil relates to the created world, not to God's character, okay? So in rough terms, Christianity says that in a world where good flourishes, the possibility of evil must exist. Now, of course, it's possible to imagine a world where evil could never exist, just as we could imagine an environment where weeds could never grow, perhaps a block of concrete floating in darkest space. So we could imagine a world where nothing bad was ever allowed to happen. So in that world, if I took a piece of wood in my hand and used it to build a house, then it would retain its structural integrity. But if I lifted that same piece of wood to beat Ollie's brains out, then the plank would suddenly become a big stick of cotton wool. In fact, in order to create a universe like that, God would have to override the muscles in my arm and the neurons firing in my brain. God would have created a rigidly deterministic mechanical world populated by automatons. Now, it's interesting. In the book of Job, when God finally does walk back on stage, he describes a very different world than that. God tells us that he created a world with boundaries and frameworks. But within those boundaries, there is great freedom and wildness. He takes us on a tour of the natural world. We hear the braying laughter of a wild donkey. We see the soaring freedom of an eagle, the strength of a wild ox, or the courage of a warhorse. And if I'm interpreting God's word correctly here, I think we're being told that if we want a world full of exuberance and joy and courage, if we want a world where good flourishes, then we need a world where people can take real responsibility and make real choices. Programmed robots don't do exuberance. So think for a moment about an Olympian gymnast, one of those Russian teenagers who can do backflips on a 4-inch beam. So as you watch someone like that, poised with beautiful balance on the beam, just think of the thousands of muscles involved, the millions of signals being processed by her brain. And that's just to achieve that magnificent balance. Now here's the point. For that skill to develop, the girl had to train in a world where gravity exists. Just imagine someone born in a spaceship on its way to some far-flung galaxy. They could never become a gymnast because they would have lived all their life with zero gravity. A child only learns to ride a bike once the stabilizers have been removed. The critical quality, the maintenance of balance, that requires a world where gravity has the real chance to pull the child to the ground. Even if the child never actually falls, the potential to fall is required.
I understand the metaphor, but how does it apply to our real lives?
Well, remember the time when you started to fall in love with Rachel?
I remember it well.
Just think back to the first time you returned a smile across the room, you quietly exchanged a steady gaze. And I guess you can remember the sheer vulnerability of those moments. But now, love has flourished. But love can only grow in a world where unrequited love is a possibility. That beautiful, intricate flower that we call love only grows if the possibility of betrayal or disloyalty exists. Now, think more widely about the good things that we admire. Not just love, but courage and innovation and compassion and truthfulness and resilience and humility. These moral qualities are like beautiful flowers. But those flowers can only grow in a soil that can also, theoretically, allow cowardice, brutality, and pride to happen.
You once gave a talk like this to a group of students at Queen's University, and during the Q&A session afterwards, an atheist student countered the point you've just made. If it's logically impossible for God to create a world where good can flourish, but where evil is impossible, then what about the Bible's talk of heaven and a new earth? If God one day can create a world free from suffering, I guess the question is, and it seems a valid one, why could he not have done that the first time?
Yeah, it was a great question. And he's right to point out about the new heaven and the new earth. Revelation 21 records those beautiful words. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. It goes on to say, God will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. Christianity says that this world, the world that we see and touch today, is a bit like a preparation ground for the next world. It's only a temporary thing. God, says the Bible, is going to create a new heaven and earth, and we shall live forever in it. In the next world, the Bible is really quite clear that not only will good things flourish, but evil, even the possibility of evil, will have been banished. So my young student friend was quite right to ask his question. If God is one day going to create a world like that, why couldn't he have made it like that in the first place? And the answer is that God can't just wave a magic wand. If we want to live in a world free from the threat of terrorism, then the terrorist threat can't be left lurking as a potential thing. It must be surfaced and then dealt with. When Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, the latent potential for evil was suddenly actualized. That potential thing that had been lurking in the depths of reality suddenly surfaced. And we find that picture at the end of God's speech in Job. In chapter 41, God talks about this terrible, fearsome creature called Leviathan. It's a sea monster, a sort of fire-breathing dragon. For most of its existence, it lurked in the deep. But suddenly it surfaces, rising in all its awfulness above the surface of the water. And other parts of Scripture have the same idea. Sin and evil, if they are to be dealt with, must be surfaced and then eradicated. Well, you say, that's all very well as a strategy, but why doesn't God, like St. George, just slay the dragon? Well, he did. The eternal Son of God entered his own universe as a man. He entered into our humanity in the person of Jesus Christ, and he entered into our humanity to put down evil. I don't think I would believe in God if the cross of Christ hadn't happened. On the cross, we don't simply see Jesus take the punishment for our sins. Of course he did that. But Christ is also the man of sorrows, the one acquainted with grief. As Isaiah says, he carried our sorrows.
That's a really interesting phrase, he carried our sorrows. What do you think Isaiah means by that phrase? And what has the cross to do with our sufferings today?
The famous theologian John Stott tells a story about a visit he made to a Buddhist temple. And he looked up at the serene face of the statue of the Buddha. And the Buddha was sitting cross-legged, his eyes closed, sitting in peaceful tranquility, detached from the suffering and heartache of the world. And Stott then says that in his mind, he travelled to that terrible scene at Calvary and looked at the spiked, tortured figure of Christ on the cross. Christianity says that at Calvary, God in Christ took the pain and suffering of this world into himself. The stories of the Buddha and the Christ represent two polar opposite solutions to the question of suffering. Some religions teach their followers to detach themselves from the world of pain and suffering. But Christianity tells the story of a God who enters into a suffering world and takes that suffering upon himself. And for people who have been almost crushed by suffering, only a God like that could command our respect. But the cross of Calvary does more than reveal the heart of God. It achieves victory over evil. The Bible says that for 3 hours, Jesus hung in the darkness and bore the wrath of God. As our Lord hung between heaven and earth, between time and eternity, we're watching a singularity, a moment when space-time contracts into something of infinite density. The incarnate Creator takes responsibility for all the evil that has emerged from the universe he created, and he pays the moral debt for a humanity which has vandalized his entire universe. But in so doing, he has overthrown evil and made the final putting down of evil possible. So Christianity offers the suffering person this wonderful gift. It's the ability to situate our present sufferings in the context of hope and restoration. And the story I told you earlier about my wife proves that point. There will come a day when the pain and hurt and sorrows of this old fallen world will be set aside. And we will live in a world where good can flourish, but where there is no latent potential for evil because it has been surfaced and dealt with at the cross of Christ.
Thank you very, very much, Jim, for those thoughts. I've got your 4 points written down in front of me. Number 1, Christianity allows you to protest. Number 2, we live in a good world gone bad. Number 3, in a world where good can flourish, the potential for evil must exist. And finally, one day, we shall live in a world with no pain.
Yes, now remember, we haven't addressed the pastoral side of suffering at all in this conversation. Perhaps, Ollie, we might do that in a later podcast. But understanding is important. It's the only ground in which hope can grow.
Thank you, Jim. I think that would be a great idea to address this topic in a more pastoral way at a later date. Thank you for listening to episode 4 of the Equip Project podcast. It's been great to have your company. We hope you can join us in episode 5. If you would like to suggest a topic or question we can talk about together, please email the Equip Project at gmail.com.